Hey guys, I'm Blaine, and I'm going to teach you how to drift in Driveclub. There's already a couple tutorials on YouTube, but none of them give you a step-by-step guide. And the reason why that is because drifting in Driveclub takes a lot of practice. You practice a lot, and then you start to get the hang of it, but only instinctively. You can't explain how you're doing it. And then you practice a lot more, and then you understand how it works, and that's kind of where I'm at. I'm not necessarily the best at it, but I'm good enough to explain how to do it and cut down your own practice time in the process. I just want to get a couple things out of the way. I do drive in third person, the chase cam. That's because I have a small TV. I would love to drive in first person, but I can't see shit while I'm doing it. But also the chase cam gives you a good view of the racing line, so it's a good view to use. I do use a controller, not a steering wheel, so there's got to be good for everyone using controllers. And this guide's going to apply mostly to small cars. It's roughly the same as drifting with faster cars, but not exactly, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. I want to start with some time trial footage because I want you to focus on the racing line. And by the way, I know the Ferrari's not a small car, but it is a beauty to drive, particularly because it drifts only when you want it to. I also stuck some weather on because you have to fight not to drift when the weather's on. And I was going to show you at night too, but you couldn't see anything, so I put it back to daylight. Anyway, back to the racing line. Drifting is about how closely you stick to the racing line, how severe an angle you can hit it at, and how fast you do it. The racing line is especially important for smaller cars because it's hard to build up speed with them, so if you want to get the big points you have to maintain your speed, hence stick to the racing line. Once you understand how important the racing line is, then you can start to learn how to drift. My racing lines aren't necessarily perfect here. Part of it is because I'm using a controller, part of it's the weather, or I'm not familiar with the track, but they're good enough to serve as examples. The gist of the racing line is out in out. Basically, you want to start out at the opposite side of the corner before the turn. You want to be in at the apex of the corner, so you want to be as tight as possible to the corner at the height of the corner, and you want to finish out, so you want to finish again at the exit on the opposite side of the road. Very basically, that's what the racing line is. And the principle is the same for drifting, especially with small cars. Like I said earlier, you want to hit the racing line to maintain your speed, which will get you the most points throughout the whole drifting event. The first thing I want to demonstrate is why the racing line is so important. And I want to do this using a high-powered car because it's more obvious, and it's not quite as dramatic with a high-powered car. As you can see here, you can really milk the points out of each individual corner and sacrifice your racing line. And it's not as dramatic with a high-powered car because you can gain speed so easily. You could gain way too much speed for the next corner, so if you sacrifice all your speed in the first corner, it's not a big deal. You might as well milk the points out. Although, with more speed, you get more points, so the racing line would still be important with them. But with the lower powered cars that don't build up speed as fast, you need to conserve your speed from one corner to the next. You cannot sacrifice the next corner to get more points in the first corner. Even with a small car though, you might as well milk the last corner, as you see me do right here. Here's a good example of prioritizing the racing line over each individual corner. I could easily have squeezed more points out of any single corner in this event, but instead I focused on preserving my speed, which maximized my points for the whole event instead of any single corner. Now that you understand the importance of the racing line, you can learn to actually drift. Drifting is very simple when you get down to it. You just pin the accelerator, pull the handbrake, and control your steering. But there are two more things you're going to want to learn. The first is shifting gears, and the other is throttle control. Basically, if you're faced with a very tight corner, you can be in a really high gear, but the more stretched out the corner is, the lower gear you're going to want to shift to as you're drifting. And throttle control is very simply, if you find yourself drifting into the field, just release the throttle a bit and you'll pull back towards the apex. Practice those two skills and you'll drift like a pro in no time. Up next, I'll teach you how to drift step by step. Let's go back to the track I was showing you the time trial on earlier. Before today, I actually had never drifted on this track. But applying the principles I was just telling you about, I managed to do fairly well on my very first attempt, which you're watching right now. Pay attention to when I'm downshifting and when I ease off the throttle, and notice how I'm trying to stay as close as possible to the racing line. The way I see it, there are essentially 5 steps to a drift. Step 1 is to build as much speed as possible. Step 2 is to line yourself up with the turn. 3 is initiating the drift. 4 is the drift itself. And step 5 is exiting the drift. The attempt you're watching now took place less than 10 minutes after the first one, and already you'll notice a drastic improvement. Step 1, build as much speed as possible. Don't be afraid to come into a corner with too much speed. Step 2, line yourself up, is essentially the exact opposite of cornering. Whereas in cornering, you want to make the turn as straight as possible, when you're lining yourself up for a drift, you want to make the turn as severe as possible. If there's only a slight curve in the road, with the angle of your approach, you can create a steep corner. Step 3, initiating the drift, means pull the handbrake. If you're only approaching a small corner, you can just tap the handbrake. But if you're approaching a steep corner, you'll need to hold the handbrake. Hold the handbrake almost until you reach the angle you want to drift at. And if you approach the corner with a lot of speed, let go of the gas while you're holding the handbrake. Step 4 is the drift itself. This is where steering, throttle, and downshifting come into play. Steering will come with practice, and like I mentioned earlier, throttle control is all about letting go of the gas if you need to come in toward the apex, and downshifting is only if you want to stretch out your curve. The 5th and final step is to exit the drift. All you want to do now is to line yourself back up with your optimal racing line so that you can start building speed for the next corner. And obviously if it's the last corner, then just drift all the way through the finish line. What you're watching now was my final attempt. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not the best at drifting. I didn't beat the high score, but I was satisfied with my score enough to leave it there. Now that you know the basics of drifting, getting better scores is simply a matter of finding the right balance between the racing line or getting the most out of every single corner. On this last clip, I'll leave you with a short summary. Remember, especially with small cars, your main priority is to maintain speed. You do this by sticking to the racing line. The 5 steps are: build as much speed as possible, line yourself up, hit the handbrake, the drift itself, where you're concerned with throttle control, gear shifting, and steering, and the last step is to exit the drift, where you just regain the proper racing line. I've been Blaine, I hope you found this video informative, and thank you for watching.